This past March, I turned 40 years old. It has now been 17 years since I was called to preach at the age of 23, began studying theology, and entered pastoral ministry. Over those years, I have served in various churches and seminaries across different cultures and languages. When I first arrived in the United States in the fall of 2009 to begin my theological training, I never imagined that I would end up staying this long to study and minister here in the States. I couldn't even speak a single sentence of English properly at the time. I never dreamed that one day I would serve full-time in an American church, getting ordained as their pastor, and later plant a Korean church here. Neither my wife nor I ever thought about planting a Korean church in America until 2020. Looking back, hardly anything turned out as I had planned. Yet what remains is a testimony to God's faithfulness and grace, leading me and my family far beyond anything I could have dreamed. Through these 17 years of ministry, there is one truth about the Christian life that I have come to see with great clarity. In this sin-broken world, believers carry many pains and burdens, some unseen by others, and some so heavy that even they struggle to speak of them. Even in homes that look peaceful and secure, unseen burdens remain. In the lives of believers who walk faithfully, hidden sorrows and quiet despair often linger. And even those who seem to live without trouble can suddenly find themselves walking through an unexpected tunnel of suffering. This is the reality of Christian life that I have personally witnessed over these 17 years of pastoral ministry. This is why our current sermon series is titled Rediscovering the Christian Life Through the Psalms. The reason I have repeatedly dealt with pain, sorrow, loneliness, and despair as we reflect on the Christian life is because, in truth, our Christian life is often filled with these very forms of darkness. And because the Psalms do not hide or avoid these difficult realities, but bring them honestly into the light, we are seeking to rediscover the true meaning of the Christian life through the Psalms. Just like the Psalms we have studied over the past few weeks, in Psalm 77, we once again meet a psalmist crying out from deep darkness. What's interesting is that in this psalm, we see the psalmist putting into practice the very two truths we have been learning these past 2 weeks. When we fall into depression and despair, first, we must not hide our negative emotions, but pour them out honestly before God. And second, we must counsel our hearts with the truths about God. The psalmist in Psalm 77 takes these very two steps. This psalmist first comes before God with his lament, then begins counseling his soul with various truths about God. But he doesn't stop there. He takes one step further. He remembers God's saving works in the past and begins to find the light of hope shining into his present darkness. As he recalls how God once led and saved his people, he is able to hold on to hope even in the midst of despair. In this way, Psalm 77 begins in deep darkness, but leads us on a journey toward the light of hope as the psalmist remembers God's past redemption. So now, we will first take a brief look at how the psalmist came before God with lament and counseled himself. Then we will more closely examine how he remembered God's redemption in the past to find hope. Point number 1, honest lament to God in the midst of darkness. Just like in the other Psalms we have already studied, the psalmist in Psalm 77 also pours out his emotions honestly before God, crying out to him in the midst of deep darkness and pain. Psalm 77, verses 1 and 2. I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. In the psalmist's desperate cry to God, we clearly see that he is not voicing bitter complaints against God, but offering a lament filled with hope in him. When suffering came, he turned first to God and raised his voice to him alone. While we do not know exactly what caused his pain, we see that his distress was so great that he could not even sleep at night. As the night grew darker, unable to rest, the psalmist likely felt that the pitch black darkness outside mirrored the darkness within his own heart. Yet even in this darkness of suffering, he longed for God, who alone could be his light of hope. What does it mean when the psalmist says he lifted his hands in prayer throughout the night and refused to be comforted? It means he was not seeking a temporary, shallow comfort that simply covers the symptoms for a moment. Instead, he longed for true healing and restoration that only God himself could give. In this deep longing for true comfort, the psalmist began to meditate on God even more deeply. Psalm 77, verses 3 and 4. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. Selah. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. Some Christians mistakenly assume that if they simply remember God and pray, all their negative emotions will melt away like snow. But in these two verses, we actually witness the opposite. As the psalmist remembers and meditates on God, he finds himself sighing even more deeply and growing even more exhausted. This shows us clearly that God is not like some genie who instantly fixes our problems at the utterance of a short prayer. Why then, even after praying and meditating, does the psalmist end up sighing more heavily and falling into deeper weariness? It is not because he prayed a wrong prayer or failed in his meditation. Rather, it is precisely because he was truly meditating on God at a deep level. The Hebrew word used here for meditate does not mean simply repeating thoughts in the mind. It refers to a deep inward wrestling, bringing God's truth down into the very depths of the heart and chewing on it in one's innermost being. The psalmist is not ignoring his painful reality, but honestly wrestling with God's truth in the midst of his suffering. The problem, however, is that even this deep meditation did not immediately change his situation. In fact, the more he remembered and meditated on God, the more sharply it collided with the reality of God's apparent absence, leading to even greater inner conflict and pain. Alan Ross explains his complex inner thought this way, quote, "The psalmist's meditations on God only intensify his anguish at first because God's past acts seem distant from his present distress." End quote. In the midst of his distress, the psalmist does not suppress his emotions or turn away from reality. Instead, he shows us the honest struggle of a believer wrestling with God's truth right in the midst of suffering. He is not looking for some cheap comfort to momentarily ease his pain. Rather, he longs for the true comfort and restoration that only God can give. And so he continues this deep inner struggle. And when his lamenting prayers do not bring him immediate peace, the psalmist begins to counsel his own heart with the truth about God. Point number 2, self-counsel in the midst of lament. Beginning in verse 5, the psalmist shows us an example that every believer ought to follow. Even in the midst of deep sighs and exhaustion, he does not stop remembering God. And through this remembrance, he begins to proclaim to his own heart the unchanging truth of God who keeps his covenant. Psalm 77, verses 5 through 9. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Selah. Some may view these questions as expressions of doubt toward God, but I am convinced that they are not questions of doubt, but rather questions filled with hope in God. As the psalmist walks through the valley of deep suffering, he anchors his thoughts in God's unchanging character, his covenant, grace, love, promises, and mercy. He meditates on these truths one by one, counseling and encouraging his own heart through these questions. This way of self-counseling reminds us of how Paul, too, proclaimed the truth of the gospel by asking a series of questions whose answers were already certain. In Romans chapter 8, Paul also raises 6 questions concerning God's love and protection. Romans chapter 8, verses 31 through 35. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is to condemn? Christ Jesus is the one who died. More than that, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed is interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? Just as Paul asked a series of questions whose answers were already certain, so the psalmist likewise asks himself these questions, clinging to God's unchanging covenant love. Let us now go through the 6 questions the psalmist asks himself and answer them one by one. Will the Lord spurn forever? Answer, no, God will never forsake you. He is the one who never breaks his covenant once he has made it. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5. And will he never again be favorable? Answer, no. God's mercies are new every morning. His steadfast love and compassion never cease. Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 and 23. Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Answer, no. His covenant love endures forever. Psalm 136. Are his promises at an end for all time? Answer, no. God is faithful. His promises never change. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23. Has God forgotten to be gracious? Answer, no. God will never forget us. Even if a mother forgets her child, God says he will never forget us. Isaiah chapter 49, verse 15. Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Answer, no. His anger lasts only a moment, but his covenant mercy endures forever. Psalm chapter 30, verse 5. And as we will see in the final portion of this psalm, where the psalmist remembers God's redemptive works and strengthens his own heart, it becomes clear that these were never questions of doubt, but hope-filled questions to counsel his heart. Point number 3. Discovering the light of hope by remembering God's redemptive history. As the psalmist continues to counsel his heart by meditating on who God is, he now starts to remember the mighty works God has already accomplished in history. Psalm 77, verses 10 through 12. Then I said, I will appeal to this, to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Through this self-counsel, the psalmist not only proclaims that God is the faithful one who keeps the covenant he has sworn to his people, but he also begins to remember how God has kept that covenant throughout history. He uses 4 different Hebrew verbs that all carry the meaning of remember. He declares his intention to recall, to bring to mind, to speak aloud, and to deeply meditate on the great and marvelous works God performed for his people long ago in order to keep his covenant promises. So then, what are these great and marvelous works that God performed to fulfill his covenant to his people? It is none other than the Exodus, the redemption of Israel from Egypt. Psalm 77, verses 13 through 15. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. You with your arm redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph, Selah. The psalmist calls the people of Israel the children of Jacob and Joseph, as he recalls how marvelously God redeemed his covenant people out of Egypt. Above all, the Exodus was a declaration that God alone is holy and most high. Why? Because through the Exodus, God executed judgments on all the gods of Egypt and brought the mightiest empire on earth to its knees. The 10 plagues that God sent upon Egypt were not random natural disasters, but direct acts of judgment that toppled Egypt's entire spiritual system. Egypt, as the world's superpower, was fortified by a strong religious structure with many gods. But through each plague, God struck down their gods one by one, revealing that he alone reigns as sovereign over heaven and earth. In the first plague, God turned the waters of the Nile into blood. The Egyptians viewed the Nile as the very source of life and worshipped it as the god Hapi. But God struck that source in an instant. The plagues that followed, frogs, gnats, flies, the plague on the livestock, boils, hail, and locusts, continued to dismantle Egypt's spiritual foundation, displaying God's dominion over the sky, the land, and all of creation. The 9th plague of darkness was especially devastating to the Egyptian empire because it struck at the very heart of Egypt's religion. The Egyptians worshipped Ra, the sun god, as their supreme deity and regarded Pharaoh as the incarnation of Ra. But God covered the land with thick darkness for 3 days, utterly shattering the power of their so-called supreme God. This was not mere absence of sunlight. It was divine judgment, symbolizing the collapse of Egypt's entire religious system. Then came the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn on the night of the Passover. That night, there was a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt because there was not a house where someone was not dead. Exodus chapter 12, verse 30. The Egyptians worshipped Pharaoh as both king and God, and his firstborn son was viewed as the divine heir to the throne, the very hope of the nation. Yet God struck at the heart of Egypt's royal and religious power, demonstrating once and for all how powerless human authority and false religion are before his sovereign rule. And so the mighty empire of Egypt fully collapsed before the God of Israel. And on that very Passover night, while Egypt was filled with wailing over the death of their firstborn, Pharaoh finally allowed the Israelites to depart for the land of Canaan. But soon after, Pharaoh's heart was hardened once again. He took his chariots and army and pursued them. Now the Israelites found themselves trapped, the Red Sea before them, and Pharaoh's armies bearing down behind them. Overcome with fear, the people began to cry out against Moses. But Moses answered them, saying, Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 and 14, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." Now the psalmist's remembrance comes to the moment when the great sea, the Red Sea, stood like an unmovable wall before the people of Israel. At that very moment, when the people of Israel had no more room to run, when the great Red Sea blocked their way in front and Pharaoh's army came thundering from behind with the sound of pounding chariot wheels, God in his mighty power parted the sea. So the psalmist declares, Psalm 77, verse 16, "When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The waters trembled and submitted before the command of their Creator. By his strong east wind, which blew all night, the Lord divided the sea, raising up towering walls of water on both sides and exposing the depths of the sea floor. What was once the unreachable bottom of the sea became a dry pathway prepared by God. The Israelites walked through on dry ground, but when the Egyptian army pursued them, the waters returned and brought swift judgment upon them. Through all of this, God declared his name and power not only before Egypt and Israel, but before all the nations of the world. And God himself explains why he raised up the stubborn Pharaoh, Exodus chapter 9, verse 16. But for this purpose, I have raised you, Pharaoh, up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. God did not raise up Pharaoh merely to judge him, but even used his stubborn, rebellious heart to display his absolute sovereignty and power to the whole world. As the psalmist reflected on God's mighty power in Israel's exodus, he likely saw his own present anguish mirrored in the cries of the Israelites who stood trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's approaching army, paralyzed by fear and despair. But as he remembered how God had crushed Egypt's false gods, humbled Pharaoh's pride, and split the roaring sea with a single command, his heart found new confidence. The overwhelming troubles pressing upon him now were no match for the God who once parted the sea. The waves of affliction that seemed so great would likewise yield and make way at the sound of his voice. In this remembrance, the psalmist came to realize afresh that what seemed like an uncrossable Red Sea in his own life was no true obstacle before God. Now, his remembrance moves beyond the Red Sea and reaches Mount Sinai, where the terrifying holiness of God was revealed as he gave his law. Psalm 77, verses 17 and 18. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. On the day God's presence descended upon Mount Sinai before the eyes of Israel, the entire mountain was enveloped in smoke, and flashes of lightning lit up the sky in every direction. The ground trembled beneath their feet as God's voice thundered like the blast of a war trumpet. The whole mountain blazed with fire, and heaven and earth shook together. No one dared approach the presence of the Holy One. The people stood at a distance, trembling in fear, while only Moses ascended the mountain to speak with God. As the psalmist recalled, both God's overwhelming power displayed at the parting of the Red Sea and his terrifying holiness revealed at Mount Sinai, he declared that the wonders of God are beyond measure. Psalm 77, verse 19. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. God's ways are beyond what human reason and calculation can predict. He is the God who makes a way through the heart of the sea, who opens a path of deliverance right in the middle of what seems like hopeless impossibility. What appeared to be a dead end to Israel at the Red Sea was in fact a pathway God had already prepared. And none of these things happened by chance. They were the unfolding of God's wisdom and sovereign plan. The footprints of God are often hidden from our sight, but one thing is certain: wherever he passes by, salvation for his people is always accomplished. As the psalmist reflected on God's unfathomable wisdom and power, he likely burst forth in praise, much like the Apostle Paul once did. Romans chapter 11, verses 33 through 36. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him, and through him, and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. As the psalmist remembered God's abundant wisdom and immeasurable power, even in the midst of his darkness, he was able to behold the light of hope. And he also remembered that this God of awesome and terrifying wisdom and power, the Most High, was at the same time his shepherd who lovingly leads him. So now the psalmist stops speaking to himself and begins confessing to God like this. Psalm 77, verse 20. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron, the Almighty God who parted the Red Sea and shook Mount Sinai. This fearfully holy God is also the gentle shepherd who leads his people with tender care. Though his people are weak and easily lose their way, he watches over them with constant care and leads them faithfully, one step at a time. As the psalmist remembered how God worked in the history of his nation, he was able to cast off the darkness of despair and behold the light of hope. And here, we too are taught what we must do when we find ourselves facing darkness and despair. We must remember God's mighty works in the past. The redemptive acts of God are not simply events from ancient history. They are special revelations of who God is. As we remember the works of salvation God has already accomplished, we can be assured that this same God is present and at work in our own lives today, faithfully carrying forward his saving purpose. Thus, Andrew Bonar once wisely said, quote, "The God who divided the Red Sea, who fed his people for 40 years in the wilderness, and who brought them into the promised land is still the same. As surely as he was with his people then, so surely is he with his people now." End quote. What encouragement does this truth give us? Dear brothers and sisters, the psalmist found hope in the midst of despair by remembering God's redemption in the Exodus. And today, we are able to look beyond the redemption the psalmist saw to an even greater and eternal redemption. Just as Israel was spared from the judgment of death and delivered out of Egypt by the blood of the Passover lamb, God has sent his only Son, Jesus Christ, to be our Passover lamb. Through his shed blood, we have been delivered forever from the slavery of sin and death. Colossians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. When we remember this truth, just as the psalmist discovered the light of hope in the darkness of his despair, we too can stand firm in the midst of our own suffering and fears. Even when the way forward seems blocked and the enemy seems to be closing in from behind, God is the one who makes a path through the sea and opens a way of salvation where there appears to be no way. He has confirmed this power through the Exodus, and even more so through the cross of Christ. The Lord Yahweh, who led Israel with covenant love like a shepherd guiding his sheep, has sent for us his Son, Jesus Christ, who is the greater shepherd and the true mediator. Jesus is greater than Moses as our Redeemer, and greater than Aaron as our perfect high priest, who shed his own blood to rescue us forever from slavery to sin and death. If we truly believe and remember the saving work of Jesus, our Good Shepherd, what do we have to fear in this world? As we hold fast to the redemption he has accomplished, we can continue to look to the light of hope, even in the darkness we face today. Through his death and resurrection, we have already been delivered from the bondage of sin and death and have been brought into his kingdom. This redemption is not merely a past event. It is alive and at work within us even now. Therefore, present sufferings can no longer crush us. Like the psalmist, we can remember the redemptive grace of God and walk boldly toward the light of hope. Therefore, here is the conclusion of the message. We can walk boldly into the light of hope, even in the midst of darkness, as we remember the salvation God has accomplished through our shepherd, Jesus Christ.